Hello again. This time I'll be introducing to you stored procedures. And stored procedures are quite different from views because although you might think that, well, views are kind of like virtual table thing, they don't really hold data and they only get executed upon being called upon. Stored procedures must be something similar, and no, not quite. Stored procedures are significantly more capable and complex bits of the SQL Server software, and basically they allow you to write very lengthy code that involves parameters being executed as someone else, which means checking that the person who is running the stored procedures, whether or not they have permissions to do so. There's a certain amount of controlling this that can be included as well. It does error handling. It also allows you to do something called dynamic SQL, which is when SQL basically writes itself. And AdventureWorks comes with a few stored procedures, which you can find in AdventureWorks, Programmability, stored procedures, and then you have about a dozen of them here. And the way you get this screen up, which is the body of a stored procedure, is that you right click on one and then just say modify. And I have already clicked modify, so I'm not going to do it because that just brings up this window. So I will explain to you what you can see here, and then in the other tab I have a few scripts that demonstrate how you can call a stored procedure and explain a few things, caveats if you please, about calling stored procedures and so on and so on. So generally speaking, when you write a stored procedure, you just write, instead of alter procedure, you would have create procedure. You then have the name, and you have any parameters that you may require. You can set them to be optional. In this case, they wrote the business entity ID, which must be an integer, the job title, which is character, the hire date, the date change date, money related things, pay frequency, and current flag, which is a data type, which is a user defined data type. And you will find that here, and we know that it's a bit, which means that it's either going to be a 0 or a 1. And this execute as caller has to do with user security checks. So it may be that whoever wrote the stored procedure has different permission levels than whoever's executing it. So this way that can go around that issue. You then have begin, and you have a begin try, an end try, a begin catch, and an end catch. And if you come from other programming languages, then you know what this is. If you don't, then it's basically error handling. So what you have in here is that anything in this block gets attempted. If you, for whatever reason, encounter an error, it then jumps onto the begin catch, where you, as the person who codes it, can tell SQL what to do if something goes wrong. Now, most often what you have is to say if there are any open transactions, which is being defined by begin transaction, and between that and the commit transaction, if there are any of those open, then roll them back, because logic says this is where you begin the whole procedure, begin try. You then begin a transaction, say update the table, and we haven't done update, but that's fine. You'll get the idea, and then we'll talk about update in a future lesson. Set all these columns to be equal to whatever parameter is being fed in here, and assume there's something goes wrong with the update because, I don't know, job title happens to be too long, or the date happens to be out of bounds or something. So it never gets here. It would then jump into begin catch. You do have an open transaction. It gets rolled back. In this case, it then executes something else, logs an error, and everything goes back to what it used to be. And actually, transactions are a very significant part of SQL. They are one of the key elements of making sure that SQL can do safe data processing. So to make sure that data doesn't get lost, two entities don't modify data at the same time, and a whole bunch of other things. And if you watch a more intermediate course in SQL, or you start especially developing SQL code, you will encounter transactions a lot more, and there's a lot more to transactions than just begin and commit or rollback. But for now, this will do. So you have your parameters, which again may or may not be optional, and you have the body, and it runs. Well, theoretically anyway. How do we run a stored procedure? And you'll find that some of this won't work, and it's not going to work on purpose, because I want you to get a better understanding of what you can do, what you can't do, and what you need to be aware of. So generally speaking, the way you execute a stored procedure is to say exec stored procedure name, and then you list the individual parameters. Now, strictly speaking, you do not need to explicitly output the individual parameters. You could just say 1, director, 20th of March 2020, and so on and so on. The issue you have is that, as you can see here, business entity ID is the first one, job title is the second one, and so on and so on. But again, as always, the idea is that you cannot trust data, and you cannot trust people working with the data, because someone may modify your stored procedure, or if it's not yours, then it just may well get modified. And the order of parameters may shift, parameters may change, and you could be passing the wrong parameter if you just say 1, director, and so on and so on. If you specify what parameter you're talking about, that will make sure that if anything changes, you will be made known about it. So it's a safeguard that you include the parameter name. Okay, so, well, going back to what we have the entity ID, which is an integer, job title, which is varchar, to date times, money, which is a number really, frequency, which again is a number, and the current flag, which is a bit. So we would think, if I run this, then, and remember F5 is to run stuff, so I'm just going to do F5. If you run this, then that should work. And it doesn't work because it's trying to convert varchar to date time, which is not allowed. And there are a few things to note, and you, whoever the user is, you need to be aware of your server's date and time settings. So if you happen to work with American settings, then it's going to be different from UK settings, because we use day, month, year. In parts of Europe, they use year, month, date, and in the US, they use whatever Americans use. So you need to be aware of this. And it's very important, because as much as certain day, month combinations are not possible, so you can't have the 12th day of the 31st month, but you could have the second day of the third month, or the other way around. So something to keep in mind, to make sure that whatever you do lines up with your own settings, and you may have to go check those settings. Okay, let's try to convert text, well, character strings really, into date time. And you can't directly convert varchar into date time. That's not possible, but you can convert it into a date, which then gets converted into date time. And 103 is the so-called culture setting, which I'm not really going to dwell too much on, because it's probably not particularly relevant at this stage. This one just says it's day, month, year, which is to say, if you happen to know that you're kind of working with the wrong setup, wrong being defined as you're out of sync with your server, then you can use the culture setting, and you can Google. There are a a few dozen culture settings, all expressed as numbers, and they just tell SQL Server that 22 means the 20th of the second month rather than the second of the 20th month. That's how you do it. So if we run this, then that works, and I haven't defined the column name, it's not relevant for what we do. So you then would think, okay, well, this didn't work, but surely this must work, because all I've done here is I just copy pasted this block into here. And you can't do that either. And that is because when you're calling stored procedures, you have to provide values. You can't do things like conversion on the fly here. As much as you would think it works, it does not work. So the way you get around it is you have to declare your values, and you do that as such. And actually, this should be as date time, if I could type, because we are expecting date time. So you declare your variables, such as HDate and RC date for higher date and rate change date. So you say variable name as what data type equals, and then in this case that's just what we want. This could be a lot more complicated. It could be a select statement from somewhere, but for the time being this is what we want. And I'm not making it complicated in terms of too much difference. It doesn't matter, it's for demonstration purposes. So one is the 20th of February, the other one is the 20th of March this year. So, and if you just run this, it just says command completed successfully, which is to say, yes, it's been taken note of, but we're not doing anything. And of course, if you run this now, it will get upset that it doesn't know what date is, because once you run this, but not this, the two get disconnected. So what you want to do is select the whole thing and F5 run. And now you'll only see it has completed successfully, because in here there is nothing to say upon successful completion do anything at all. We could say send a message to say yes, successfully completed, but we're not really doing that. Microsoft hasn't done it. But you now get the idea that usually it's totally fine to pass fixed bits of data like one or director and single quotes. But if you have to do a conversion, you have to do it before you executing stuff. And this is basically the rundown on stored procedures. There's a lot more to stored procedures, as I said, dynamic SQL and a whole bunch of other things. But for the time being, this being a basic course, I think this will give you a good idea how to handle stored procedures. And of course, if you want to start a new one, like you want to write your own stored procedure, you can always just take an example and just use that. So as I said, what you need to do if you're doing a new one is change that to create, and now it's going to get unhappy because this one exists already, so we can't create this one. But you can always take, for example, this as an example, and once you've created it, you then go back to alter, and then you can modify it any way you please. And I invite you to experiment. Try to write something like select something where the parameters are whatever you define, or you can try to do an update later when we already cover the update in more details. So this is for now. We won't get back to stored procedures throughout this course, but once you get towards the end of the course, you should have a better idea of what some of the things you encounter in here are, what's an update, what's an insert, how to do values, and then you can come back and try to poke around or make your own stored procedure, and that makes it a lot more interesting. So thanks for watching.